Good evening. Tonight I thought I'm gonna bring up this topic which keeps creeping up here in the media with the Nazi movement in the Ukraine. And the reason for this, there was another lengthy article about it on NBC published it, pointing out various different groups in the Ukraine and their ultra right wing, ideology and that sort of stuff. And there's a couple experiences I wanted to share with you. One is my Twitter experience, which goes in that directions and what I found out. And then on the other hand was just to take a general look at why this kind of right-wing stuff has gained popularity, not just in the Ukraine, but in other countries as well. But before we get there, I want to share with you my family's background for the Albrecht line with the Nazi movement. And because we had some issues, not really issues, but let me explain this on how we were involved or were not involved as a family. For this, we have to know two things. My great-grandfather was the middle child. There was one older brother and one younger brother. The older brother was in charge of the estate as the oldest child. My great-grandfather, the middle child, was entitled to, a apanage is the French word, or an allowance, basically, on a monthly basis. So was his younger brother. I know for sure that my great-grandfather and my grand-uncle had fought in World War II. World War One, but I'm not sure about the youngest brother. I don't know the whole history there with the youngest one because he was into politics on a county level, and I don't know. And he had been married, and they had children already by that time. So I'm not quite sure if he was drafted or if he was not involved. But both of my great-grandfather and my grand-uncle were both active in the military. My great-grandfather got shot. He had he got shot in the rear, and that kind of, in his buttocks, and that ended his military career in 1915 in the middle of it, and he had a slight limp. That was the end of it. His brother made it through okay. He didn't get shot or injured, and I don't know if he was there the entire time or if he got dropped out by 1917. I couldn't tell you that because I can't remember the entire military record on this. But both of them were veterans. So was my grandfather, who was 17 at the time, and he became a pilot on these triple-decker airplanes for the last, I would say, 16 months of the war. So that would have been, he must have been 15 and a half, 16 when he joined or something like this. He was very young. He was basically underage, but they let him do this since he was basically just flying airplanes at that point. So all three of those had served. And as the revolution started to near in Berlin there in November 1918, they were living, all three of them, in Berlin at that time already. And like I shared in the other videos, the Berlin Palace, which was the Prinz Albrecht Palais in the middle of Berlin there, not too far away from the Brandenburg Gate, it had been divided into apartments. So my grandfather had an apartment there, and both of my great-grandfather and then the grand-uncle had a larger apartment in there since he was the executor of the estate, basically. Well, anyway, it was also then my my granduncle who gave the money for the car rental business, by the way. That's where the money actually came from, was from the uncle. And my great grandfather was a musician. He was a cellist. He played cellist and he composed music. But he was primarily, he conducted, but primarily he was a cellist. He played the piano, but he basically started to play professionally right after 1918, 1919, for several different symphony orchestras there in Berlin. I don't know exactly which ones. I have to look through the records and stuff like this, and in various different places in Germany. And he got paid for this, so he really didn't need the allowance from his brother, because he was pretty much self-supporting fully. He was doing his own thing there with the music, and he also taught music. So that was another thing, is he got paid for the lessons when he gave lessons in cello and piano. And so he was pretty much out of it. And my grandfather got into this whole automotive thing then. And I think by 1923, they had decided to get fully into the car rental business. And like I said, my granduncle gave the money for this. Now, my granduncle lived primarily in Kamienik Zapkowicki, which is Poland today. In German, that was Kamenz. And that was they had, that's out in the boondocks, basically. If you really get there, you have to travel to Warsaw, and then you probably have another 20-minute drive or so, a half an hour train ride from Warsaw to Kamienik Zapkowicki. It's pretty out in the boonies. And there they had the castle, and they had agricultural operations out there. And at that point, we still owned two plantations in East Africa, which is today, what is it? I can't remember the name of the country. Well, at that point, it was East Africa. And if I remember the name, I will share it with you. So that was the primary operation which generated US dollars, because the coffee beans were sold on the open market. Back then in the 1900 in the 20th century, all of the stuff was traded. A lot of it went to Germany, but the trade was conducted in US dollar. So my granduncle had US dollars coming in at the time, so they were pretty much recession-proof in the early 1920s, and they weren't really affected by the hyperinflation. In Tanzania, now I remember that. That's what happens to me all the time. Is I'm looking for a word or something, and then a minute later, so it comes. It was in Tanzania. Today's Tanzania, East Africa, and we didn't have any slavery or any of that stuff. These people who worked there were paid, and we never had any type of uprisings and any of that stuff. That was a smooth running operations. My granduncle and my great 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 grandfather, they were interested of having things run smoothly and quietly so they could make money with this. This was the primary objective. They weren't into any of this exploitation stuff. Anyway, so this was the main revenue coming in, and then in Kamienik Zapkowicki, the main operations were brewery, vineyard, and then regular, wheat and wheat production, that sort of stuff. They weren't really into livestock or anything with this. But my granduncle, he had a vegetable garden next to the castle and the Lutheran church. That is a church built out of red brick. That is basically empty today. The church is still there, so is the castle. And the Polish people have rebuilt this, and they did a real nice job, and that is open to the public today. Just to throw that into the mix. Anyway, in 1921, there were certain ex-military people, there was this backstabbing thing and that sort of stuff, out of mostly the officer ranks, who kind of came together and they formed a organization. And that organization was called Consul. And my granduncle was more into this than my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was a musician. He lived and was breathing music. He wasn't interested in war. He didn't really want to be a soldier in this whole royalty stuff. What he was in was really not his cup of tea. He was someone who liked to play with music. He was happy being a cellist among other cellists in a symphony orchestra and that sort of stuff. And he was very well liked and accepted in that environment. So he had a pretty easygoing time. Anyway, my granduncle was the one who was more politically motivated. And the Organization Consul was to the right, but it was far distanced from the nationalist socialist movement, which had started with Hitler and a few other people there. We're getting now back in the very early days into the 1920s. And the reason for that was being the Operation Consul was more like a officers thing, ex-officers, versus the Nazis that was more the blue-collar environment, and middle class. So they were not seeing eye to eye. And neither one of these two organizations at the time had exactly the same ideas. The Organization Consul, was not interested in anti-Semitism. They were not interested in any of this stuff. Their primary goal was to get rid of the Versailles Peace Treaty. And they were greatly at odds with the socialist government at the time. And these people went to that extent because of their training. And I'm not quite sure how many members they had, maybe 500 to 1,000. And it was an underground operation, really, what they had going there. They actually winded up assassinating politicians, mostly out of the left spectrum. In charge, I can't remember all of the names, but there must have, in the first part of the 1920s, probably 20 to 30 people got killed. And the way my granduncle was involved with the Operation Consul was by allowing the people, say, like, who would conduct these operations, these assassinations, to train on the grounds in Kamienic Zapkoviki. And that went so far that they actually had live ammunition training, and with hand grenades and everything, right next to the vegetable garden with the church. So that field next to that area over there, that must be littered with metal, shrapnel and God knows what else. And they stayed at the castle in Kamienic Zapkoviki when they were there, and they conducted their trainings and exercises, and a lot of these plans were basically worked out there. He wasn't directly involved, but he facilitated all of the stuff. Anyway, this got to the point where in the mid-1920s, the German government at that time started to outlaw the Organization Consul, and they had to basically disband at that point because of the implications. I don't know of any members who were ever really arrested for the assassinations they successfully completed or not. But what I can tell you is that in the 1950s, the U.S. government did an extensive study on that organization. And most of these research papers, they're accessible through the library, the library in Chicago. And I think that is the university library, which has all of those documents. And my granduncle is mentioned in them, and that vegetable garden thing is in there too. I looked at some of the stuff. They evaluated this because it was basically the first known or early forms of what we would consider today domestic terrorism. They didn't call it back then that way, but that was it. So by the 1920s, that sort of had come to an end. And they kind of disbanded, and there was no more killings after that. The Nazis had looked at this, but as we noticed, they went a different route with their beer hall putsch, trying to overthrow the Bavarian government, trying to seize then control over Germany that way, which failed, which Hitler then, wound up and his other guys in custody, in prison there for a while, in or near Munich for a year or 2 years, whatever that was. And then pretty much the latter part of the 1920s was pretty quiet. Now, what happened is with the stock exchange crash in 1929, the entire coffee bean market went down South Hill, basically. So the revenue in US dollars basically had stopped, and they were trying to figure out on how they can make money. By that time, the car rental business was doing all right. And like I said, they may have had 20 cars, 40 cars, something in that range. Probably it was closer to 40 cars by that time. It was 1930. And so my grandfather had moved out of the castle there. He had his own apartment because he had a girlfriend at the time, which was then my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and she was Jewish. So they dated and they moved out. They moved closer to where the car rental business was, and that was pretty practical. More practical in the time. It took less time to travel and all of the stuff. Plus, my granduncle spent most of the time in Kamieniec Zapkowicki at that point anyway. So the only person who was really left at the palace was my great-grandfather. So he was more or less by himself in there, and he may had a staff of 1 or 2 people at the very most in there. He was pretty self-sufficient, so he really didn't need anyone to do anything. So the people who were there basically took care of the building and the grounds of what needed to be taken care of. Anyway, so this whole US dollar deal had collapsed, and my granduncle decided to sell the plantations to the British, because it was under British control at that point, Tanzania, after that colony was lost after World War I, from Germany to England. But he was allowed to operate his, and keep the coffee plantations. And so he sold them 1930, somewhere around there, because they were losing money. The coffee beans were too expensive, and the whole market had completely derailed and everything else. Now, as a result out of this, he built up some form of a debt to the taxpayer, to the Weimar Republic. And what he did is he winded up then renting the castle to the Weimar Republic. So they paid rent, and they used it as housing for dignitaries who came to visit them. International diplomats and that sort of stuff who had to stay somewhere, so they were put in there. So my great-grandfather, he moved out. He moved in with my grandfather. They were living now together. My grandfather, his fiance at that point, basically, and my great-grandfather. And that went until 1933. So 1933, when Hitler came to power, the castle was now empty because Hitler canceled the lease agreement they had with my granduncle. So the castle was now empty, so my great-grandfather went back there. And in Germany, when you move, at that time already before the Nazis, you had to, with the socialists, I think it started, you had to register with the city hall when you moved there, where you were living and who was living with you. And then when you moved somewhere else, you had to go to both places to unregister and to register in the new place. So he went back and he registered there. So he's the only occupant now registered. My granduncle is in the books as the owner for the castle, and he is in there as a tenant. That's how it is listed. And you can read it in the Berlin Address book if you were interested in it. You can look through the years. In 1934, my granduncle gets a letter from the IRS, from the German IRS at that point, which was now the Hitler IRS, basically, that he was owing tax money, even though he had the deal with the Weimar Republic, but they didn't honor this. So now these people basically, and there's a court record available, so anyone who look at this, you can look this up for the Prinz Albrecht Palais under my granduncle's name. The documents are available in the archives in Berlin for the state of Berlin. Not just the city, but the state. That is all documented, including the court records. So the Nazi government winded up suing him for the debt, and he couldn't really pay it without selling anything else. So, and my granduncle was gay, so and there were connections he had in the gay community, where now there were gay SS officers, which were close to Heydrich. So they came, and that he talked to one of his gay friends, and they got Heydrich interested, and then Heydrich said, well, then we're going to rent the castle. So that's how that court case disappeared, and that's how the tax issue was resolved, basically. So now, in early 1935, Heydrich takes over the Prinz Albrecht Palais as the headquarters. My grandfather moves out. He unregisters from there, and from now on, it is listed as SS building. That's basically how it is in there until 45. The owner is still on the books is my granduncle. So they never transferred ownership of this, which is basically they lived in there rent-free and he didn't have to pay any taxes. Something to that tune. And as we know, is that building, Heydrich got executed, assassinated in Prague. Probably pretty good. And the castle got bombed into bits and pieces during the Allied raids. So now we're going fast forward 1945, 1947, 50. In 1951, my great grandfather had died in 1939. My granduncle had died in 1940. Now, my grandfather was all by himself, basically. In the city of Berlin, because he's the only living relative in this whole thing, was sent a letter by the city of Berlin. And I don't know if that was still the Greater Berlin or only the west sector, because the property actually for the castle is on the west side. They sent him an invoice or a letter with a demand to basically clear up, to demolish the ruins of the castle and to clear the property of any debris on it. He sends a letter back to them and he says, well, we weren't the last occupant of this. So there's a part which is not fully, which I can't fully explain, is because the title was never, or the deed was never transferred. The deed was still in my granduncle's name. That is what the city of Berlin states. And he says, no, the entire, so my grandfather writes a letter back and he says to the city of Berlin, the property was transferred to the SS completely. We have nothing to do with this. So then they're coming back 6 months later, and they sent another demand letter, and that went on to 52. And by 1952, the city decided they're gonna tear it down. So they wind up sending an invoice to my grandfather for the demolition of and the removal of the debris of the ruins, whatever was left on there. And that was torn down, and there's documents and all of this stuff. So my grandfather writes another letter back to the city, and he says he's not going to pay for it. So that was basically the end of the story. And then they send another letter back with a payment reminder to pay this. Then he sent a letter back, and he asked him to go to the main Hohenzollern, office and have them explain this, because when my granduncle died, the properties were transferred over to another part of the family. And that was an internal deal where the other part of the family basically paid my grandfather and his 4 or 5 cousins. He had 5 cousins. They were all girls from the younger brother off, and that was divided. So the entire estate was divided by 5. 5, I think it was 4 girls, yeah. And so we had nothing really to do anymore with the property, but this is the whole thing, what our experience was with the Nazis. Besides this, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, got deported in 1940 because she was Jewish, even though my grandfather had my father and my uncle as minor children at home. She got deported and wound up in Lodz, Poland, in the Jewish ghetto there. And we don't really know what happened to her, but she passed away somewhere between, we would say, the end of 1940 until 1945, in that range. We don't know what happened to her. So my grandfather was now at home with two children, and he had to go back into military service, even though he was in 1940, 39 years old. And he went into the medic division and as a ambulance driver, basically, to get the soldiers from the front line to the closest field hospital. That's what he was doing, basically. And we had with the car rental business was, we had a shoemaker next to us, and the shoemaker had two girls, and the girls were a little bit younger, maybe 10 years younger or so than my grandfather. And the youngest daughter, she was married already to a guy, and they had a son, and they were about the same age as my father and his brother. And her husband had to go into the military service, and he got killed in Russia in the Operation Barbarossa. So when my grandfather, that happened right there. So when my grandfather was going in, he left my father and my brother with her and the shoemaker, because they were that close, because their businesses were right next to each other, and they had known each other for a long time. And after Heydrich had taken over the castle, my grandfather had moved in on the same, my great-grandfather had moved in on the same block where the car rental business was and the shoemaker was. So he was close by the family, so they all knew each other until he passed away in 39. So he lived there for 35 to 4 years, basically. That's where he lived. He had a one-bedroom apartment up on the second floor or third floor, and my grandfather and a few friends, they carried the piano upstairs, and then he had his cello up there, and he was happy, and and he would come by either by my grandfather, with my grandmother. They would have lunch there and that sort of stuff. He would come by there every day, and the shoemaker made their shoes, and then he rented the cars and that sort of stuff over the weekend. So they all knew each other. And then my grandfather, after the war, winded up marrying that younger lady, and that's what I refer to commonly as my grandmother, because I've never met my maternal grandmother, as she perished in this entire thing. Now, with this being said, now you have somewhat an idea on how complex these things can get. Our general feeling in the family was never pro-Nazi whatsoever, looking at all the issues and characters involved in this, and the issues we had looked at the Nazis. That was something it just didn't fit into our family political views as being more conservative and in a libertarian way as well, more that kind of field, and so no one really, with my granduncle, none of them were anti-Semitic either. And the only reason why they ever associated with it was because of this tax deal he had going there with him in Weimar first, and then when Hitler came in. That was sort of our experience with this. And now going back to this thing in the Ukraine, and this is something I have noticed, and on Twitter. This video is going to be a little bit longer tonight. But I felt I had to not explain this. I don't really have to explain myself, but I thought I'm going to share this for the interested viewers so they have a better idea of, why I may lean one way or the other. So I'm not a great supporter of anything right-wing or Nazism. It's just not in my political belief system. This is too far out for me. The first thing is in 2014, I broke my right leg, and I had a triple fracture there, and they had to put a nail in it and screws and all of the stuff. So I was in the hospital for 4 or 5 days here. And while I had time in the hospital, I had I didn't have the iPhone then. I had a tablet. I searched around on tablet, and I came across a website which was written in Ukrainian or Russian or Ukrainian, in English, and they documented on their website how they were unearthing old Nazi or war memorabilia, because these people were going around in the Ukraine with metal detectors in these fields where they suspected that they had battles going on, and they were basically digging all of the stuff up. And it was a loose association of people who were interested in this. Let me put it that way. And they had also amassed pictures of the SS, and that sort of stuff. They had a wide collection of this stuff. And they would basically take out all the ammunition, belt knuckles, any type of Nazi memorabilia or Wehrmacht memorabilia you can find when you unearth the stuff. But they didn't properly deal with the remains of the soldiers. I mean, when you have a metal detector, you don't know, are you going to find a foxhole from the Russians or the Soviets or from the Germans? Anyways, they went through it, and they dealt with neither one of the remains of the soldiers in a way I would have found to be acceptable. Anyway, and what turned out is they had amassed a huge collection, and they were, of course, mostly interested in the Nazi stuff, and that surprised me. And at that point, I didn't realize this, that the Ukrainians felt the way they did towards the Russians in terms of being somewhat oppressed. This was just right after the Maidan Revolution had happened, and that shift started to change, that I found this. And I said this was odd. Most people in Germany, first of all, it's prohibited to own any of this stuff. There's probably another 3 or 4 or 5 countries, a handful, where you cannot own any type of Nazi memorabilia. Austria might be one of them. I think Switzerland is pretty strict on this stuff. I do not know how the French deal with this, but Germany, it is definitely out, and I think Israel also has a ban on those things. But here in the United States and other countries, the UK, for instance, there's collectors of the stuff out there. This is what these young people did in the Ukraine. They would basically dig up the graves or these battle sites, get all the memorabilia out of it, whatever it was, helmets, uniform pieces, IDs, dog tags, you name it, whatever you can find there, whatever survived. They pulled complete tanks out of rivers out there, the old Leopard tanks or whatever it was. And there seemed to have been some fascination with this stuff. And this is usually, to make money with something like this is one thing. The biggest market for these things is, I've been watching the auctions for the memorabilias. And just to give you an example, a few years ago, there was one of the order stars for our Order of the Black Eagle available at an auction house. They're very rare because they had to be returned after death from the knight. The knight's family had to return this to the herald's office. And you don't come by them very often. And that one was going for about 10,000 euro. The memorabilia out of these grave sites for SS officers, especially these more recognition awards, like the Iron Cross First Class with the diamonds and that sort of stuff, they go for 100,000 euros, 10 times as much as what this order stuff goes, where you hardly can get anything. So this shows you on how people value the history. So the Prussian, from Prussia, from the Kingdom of Prussia, or even the early periods of the empire, the German Empire, does not yield yields only a fraction of this, what rare Nazi memorabilia will bring. And that seems to be a global phenomenon. This is something I realized. I said, wow. To look at this, to say, a star of our order is valued at a tenth of a iron cross with diamonds or something like this, which Hitler gave some guy who then died in the Ukraine on a battlefield, and that brings 100,000 euros. So I said there must be something profoundly turned upside down in our world if people value right-wing, anti-Semitic ideology that more than the Lutheran-based, libertarian-based environment of Prussia. That made me think. That made me really think. And the interesting thing is this: what we found out after the reunification was that there was a strong support of right-wing ideology in East Germany, even though the communist, government was always that great anti-Nazi thing, similar to what we're hearing now out of Russia from Vladimir Putin and his government. That goes more in that direction. And it looks like it is more people resented that a Stalinist kind of thing is more right-wing they became. And you can see this in the Ukraine, and you can see this in Russia actually itself, that you have these kind of sort of neo-Nazi groups. They're not very public. They're not very, verbal about it or anything like this. It's kind of an underground movement. But they're doing the same thing. They're going through Russian battlefields and trying to find what it is, what they got there. But they're dealing with the remains very differently as they're getting properly reburied. But all of this stuff now, all of these Nazi memorabilia have been coming onto the market through various private auction sites, not eBay, but private auction sites by invitation. I have subscribed to two of them, primarily for the monarchy, the early stuff before 1918. But in the catalogs, you can see what they got. And then when the auction is over, you can see how much more money they were getting for Nazi memorabilia. I think the craziest part was some piece of garment from Hitler, which went like for 300,000 or 400,000 euro. It is just absolutely ridiculous. So there seems to be a fascination with this type of ideology. Now, I grew up in West Germany, and we had extensive history classes, say like from grade 7 to 10, about the whole Nazi movement, how it came about, what we have to watch out for, that, the anti-Semitism and everything else what comes with it. And I wonder what other countries actually teach their students in high school about World War II, about anti-Semitism, and Nazism in general. And why these people are so fascinated with this type of anti-Semitic, anti-almost anything what is not pure of that race, that whole race ideology. You can take any race, you can substitute the Aryans with another ethnic group in there, and then apply the same principle to it. And I'm looking at this, I say something does not sound right here. That there's something has gone very much astray, and that is part of this war, what we're seeing now in the Ukraine. It is a fundamental lack, and this is something I'm not sure what our elected officials in Europe or here in the United States are going to do about it. And how this can be properly dealt with. Now, when you have people who keep Nazi memorabilia, one U.S. soldier who was fighting over there had posted a picture of a BMW motorcycle which survived the war in the Ukraine. The Ukrainians have kept it. And I looked at the markings on there, and that was the Feldjäger. That was the MP, the Wehrmacht's MP, which had the big chain around them. And they were, in German, the German Wehrmacht soldiers called them die Kettenhunde, the chain dogs, basically. They were basically the ones who were collecting the guys who started to poop in their pants when it started and ran away. They were picking those up. And a lot of times those people, deserters, they were shot, executed on the spot by these people. And so I'm finding this interesting. Of all the memorabilia, this is this kind of stuff. This is what they have kept. Now, in Germany, Scholz is doing that. That was my next thought. Scholz is doing this dance and eggshells there with tanks, and we're going through this big discussion, and we're looking at all these parts from all these different angles because of the history in this. And here's people, they got a motorcycle, a BMW motorcycle, fully functioning with sidecar, which belonged to the Wehrmacht MP. And are they waiting for German tanks? They must have thought the world of us, not of today's Germany, Nazi Germany. And if no one explains it to those people, to the regular people, that today's Germany is not Nazi Germany, the memorabilia you have in the Ukraine is not what Germany stands for since 1945 or 1949, 1950, then you're going to be greatly disappointed. And this is what I'm seeing. So I think it was yesterday I posted a picture of the tanks which were on transport going to, or they're most likely in the Ukraine. And I thought that they looked like or resembled the Panther 1 or the Leopard 1 tank. So I posted this up. I got it from TikTok because there's quite a few soldiers I'm following, Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers, both to get an equal, combat experience of what each side sees and how what they're actually looking at, to have a balance in it. And I have then a direct view to the battlefield, basically, as much as they can send information and what they're sending. And I posted this now on Twitter with the hashtag Ukraine and hashtag Ukraine war and hashtag Leopard 1. And it got almost 500 views within 10 minutes. It got 1 like. And I got 1 comment. The first comment came from a Twitter user in Germany. They said, this is not a Leopard 1, this is a CV-90. That is common equipment in Scandinavia. Okay, I left it by that. I posted another picture, which you haven't seen yet. That is a mortar tank on a railroad car in NATO green, olive green, camouflage, with a Bundeswehr license tag, and someone they probably had photoshopped this. I found that picture online with the American flag and the Ukrainian flag on there. So I posted this, and I said this is an M113, which it wasn't. And that almost got 1,000 views within 10 minutes, and everyone liked it. I mean, you could just see the likes were going up and up and up and up and up and up. Then the same guy from Germany, he writes underneath a comment, he says, this is not an M113, that is a mortar tank. Okay. So what I did is, I corrected both postings. I deleted the initial postings, which had gotten a huge emotional response. And I put the mortar tank in under mortar with the same picture. And I put the Panther in as the CV-90, which it most likely is. And you know what? It didn't get 1 like. And most of the people who like this stuff, most of the viewers who are following the Hashtag Ukraine war and Ukraine are the people who live in Ukraine and speak English. So this is interesting. Now, if you tell them it's this, then from the United States, immediate like. If it is now a mortar tank, no response. If it is a CV-90, no response. The Leopard 1 had gotten at least one like when I declared the CV-90 as a Leopard 1. This is how complicated this is, and this is how emotional this is. Now, if you would have put in there a Tiger tank from Adolf, I don't know, million likes, I have no clue. One thing I know for sure is the people who watch this stuff and follow this on Twitter, they cannot separate a mortar from an M113. The picture of the CV-90 versus the Leopard 1 was pretty difficult to see. You know, they have the same outline and body form. The only way you can see it is by the cannon, if you take a real good close look at it. But this is, the experts can deal with this kind of stuff. But there is virtually nothing there. It is all emotionally driven. And only it is sensationalism. And the Americans right now are regarded higher than any other country because of the perceived support they have been getting, which is true because America reacted pretty swiftly in this. That Germany reacted the way we reacted is based on our history, you know. And like I said, we have fought in these very particular areas already. The Wehrmacht was there. And against the Soviet army, the Red Army at this point. So this is something for us which we're very careful about it. But like I said, I'm pretty much for a arms support for the Ukrainians. And I think regardless of how far right this actually is, because there's going to be a big chunk of people there who are probably not as far to the right, but they're concerned about their country, you know. And in this case, when you have that kind of an issue to begin with, then the people who were in the middle, they're probably going to shift even more to the right. But what frustrates me or what disappoints me is the fascination in foreign countries with Nazism, with Nazi memorabilia and everything else, because you can't really take out anti-Semitism and the Holocaust out of this whole picture. All of these millions, tens of millions of people, you know, you had the Holocaust with 6 million people. There were other people who got killed in this too. God knows how many million people those were. The Russians lost 20 million, or the Soviet Union lost 20 million people. We lost 4 million Germans. The French, everyone lost people, the Japanese, the Americans, everyone. This was such a tragedy. 50 million people, 100 million people, somewhere around there. It was a tremendous amount of people who have died in that war, and it was all based on the ideology of Nazism, of right-wing totalitarianism. And for people to be attracted to this today, what is that now, 80 years later, 90, 80 years, 75 years later, it's pretty bad. And then looking at this, anything what comes out of the pre-1918, the monarchy times, you know, that is of no value to people. But right-wing extremism is. That is something we have to look within all our societies, not just, you know, globally, to see the scholars ask you, the politicians ask, they have to really think about this. That's at least my take. I'm saddened by this fact that these kind of things are more attractive. So if Nazism is more attractive than Germany today, and Germany is only attractive because of our weapons to them, because they need them at this point, you know, this raises a lot of questions. Yes, I understand they need help, and as Germany, we're definitely probably going to be able to help them. and we will give them what they need. And thank God for the United States with all the support they have been giving them. And the United States has an easier starting position because they don't have that historic wreckage in there with the Holocaust and everything else what came with it. But that is something we have to think about. I probably have to say that there has to be something better there. And we have to learn how to transmit this to people in other countries, that there is something better, and it is not Nazism what made Germany Germany. It is something else. It is not Nazism. And that is a message which Germany has to think about on how they want to deal with this, and then we may have to look in the history books, school books in other nations, and have to say, well, we have an opinion about this, what you teach your children. If it comes to Nazism in our time from, say, like from 1928 until 1945, we may have to take a more active role in this, a guiding role. And then we hope that these nations are going to listen to us. And with that, you have a great evening.